Welcome, everyone. I'm Carl Bruch, and I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and I'm president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. It's wonderful to have you joining us today. We have a very important topic that I know some of you have worked on environmental peacebuilding and had to show your impacts. Others are coming more from the M&E side of things. And we are really excited to have this discussion. This is part of a partnership between ELI, the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, and the United Nations Environment Program, with support from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I'm very happy to see that we have both Tegan Blaine and Jeremy Moore here from USIP, and I wonder if I might invite Tegan to say a few words. Jeremy, if you're able to or interested, you're also welcome to join in the welcome. And after this, we have a brief survey that we would like to do before we get started, but we'll say more about that in a moment. Tegan?
Thank you so much. Jeremy, I'm glad that you were able to join in the end. So if you want to add something, please feel free. My name is Tegan Blaine, and I am at the U.S. Institute of Peace. As Carl said in his introduction, this work on monitoring and evaluation is in part supported by the U.S. Institute of Peace as part of a set of grants that were made as we were standing up our new program on climate, environment, and conflict. Personally, I see this work as useful for two very distinct reasons. First off is one reason that's linked to the white paper on the future of environmental peacebuilding that was released this morning. It noted that the field of environmental peacebuilding can sometimes be criticized as conceptually sloppy, perhaps in part because it's still very new, and perhaps in part because people are still trying to figure out how to communicate the success of what they're doing. From my perspective, this investment in monitoring and evaluation is a way to bring rigor to this field, because we can really use monitoring and evaluation to report more accurately on what this field actually manages to accomplish. But more importantly, perhaps, a strong M&E system allows us to get a better idea of what's actually working and what we should try to build upon and what we might want to jettison. It helps us strengthen the overall field by really allowing us to focus better on learning and continuing to develop in how we're implementing environmental peacebuilding. So those are the two reasons that I am so pleased to see this work being presented at this conference, and really look forward to learning from Carl Bruch and the rest of his team about all of the thinking and learning they've been doing and how they're beginning to establish an environmental peacebuilding M&E system. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it back off to the organizers.
Tegan, you did a wonderful job of motivating this and made our life easier in framing the discussion. Before we move to the survey, I just wanted to see if Jeremy would like to add a few words.
No, thanks. Tegan summed it up perfectly.
Okay. So Shehla, did you have, Amanda, did you have a pre-survey, pre-course survey that we wanted to share? This is really to get to know you and to understand where you are in kind of how you're approaching this set of issues.
Just shared it in the chat, Carl.
So there's a Google form there. If everybody can just take 30 seconds, it should be fairly straightforward to fill this out. And Amanda, are we able to share the results as they flow in?
Yes, I can share my screen and show the results.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, thanks.
I got it already, no problem. All right. All right, are folks able to see that? Okay, so I will just kind of take us down the screen and you all can take a look at these wonderful graphics for us. We got another one coming in there.
I think it's interesting that we have mostly people who are trying to figure out how to do M&E of their work rather than M&E people trying to figure out how do we work in the space of environmental peace building. And it looks like there's a wide range of experience. Looking forward to good tools, building networks, learning from others. I think the network, I think, is interesting to note because we do have the M&E interest group that has been central in developing this, and Amanda Woomer and Juha Wito lead that. And our hope is that we're not only going to produce a toolkit and other materials that I'll mention, but that we will be able to continue the learning after this. Tools and principles, the resources about conflict-sensitive M&E, latest on M&E tools being used, and using it in the field, measuring outcomes, improving M&E. Excellent. Amanda, anything else that you would like to add here?
No, nothing from me. I do appreciate back at the top of the screen, yeah, the variety of organizations that folks work for, and that most of you are programmatic, and we can definitely speak more to that side of things.
All right, should I unshare this then, Carl?
Yes, please. And then I think it's over to you to introduce the agenda, Shehla.
Absolutely. Alex, if you could share the PowerPoint. Wonderful. So Carl has already welcomed you all, but I'd like to just take a couple of moments to go through a little bit of the roadmap for our session. So next slide, please. So today, your facilitators, you've already met Carl. To introduce myself, my name is Shehla Chowdhury. I'm a research associate at the Environmental Law Institute, and I work very closely with Carl and Amanda on our project on improving the monitoring and evaluation of environmental peace building. We're also joined by Dr. Amanda Woomer, who you heard from a little bit with our survey, as well as Dr. Eric Abbottwell and Dr. Erica Key, who will be working to facilitate some of the breakout groups that we'll be going through later today. All of us here are involved in the project, Carl, Amanda, and myself being key project staff, and of course, Eric and Erica being very honorable members of our advisory group. So if we could get the next slide. So just to run through the agenda, I know we have quite a bit of time on our hands with you all today, which we're very excited about. To give that a little bit more organization, of course, we are starting with a quick welcome, and we will be moving on to a few presentations. So first, a presentation from Carl, which will be an introduction to environmental peace building M&E, followed by an exercise, which will take you into breakout groups, followed by another presentation on monitoring by Amanda, another exercise focused on indicators and crafting good indicators for your project. Of course, we'd like to give you all a little break. A lot of time spent on Zoom can be quite fatiguing. And then after 10 minutes, we'll come back together for a short presentation on evaluation, a short presentation on learning, bring it all together in a full group discussion, and then we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for you all to give us feedback, because as Carl will talk about, your feedback and what you care about in terms of monitoring and evaluation is incredibly helpful to us as we try to sculpt our toolkit, which we hope will be a good tool for you all pretty soon in the future. All right, and with that, I think I can hand it back to Carl.
It helps if you unmute. Next slide, please. So this is a 2-year project that really is seeking to improve how we think about and undertake monitoring and evaluation of environmental peace building. And we spent much of the first year collecting, digesting, and synthesizing what the current knowledge is. This has been done through literature review, a survey of the gray literature, the non-peer-reviewed publications. There's a lot of experience in the practitioner community that has not yet reached the peer-reviewed literature. We've also been conducting interviews with key informants to make sure that we are capturing the most extensive body of experience. Again, a lot of stuff is not making it into the literature yet. We've done some consultations, and one of the most interesting things have been the series of peer learning workshops where somebody who's working on a specific issue puts it up for essentially a safe discussion using the Chatham House rule for 10 to 20 people to noodle over. And so it's very much problem oriented. And how would you address this? What are your options? What have you done in similar situations? And that all of that has generated this body of information that we are now digesting into a series of publications for different audiences. There's a toolkit which is focusing on practitioners. We have a review article in the works more for the academic and theoretical community. We have a policy brief that is for the for funders and for other decision makers. And then those are the 3 main publications we are producing. We also have an online platform that we've been occupying with the results of our literature search and a community of practice that we have been cultivating. I will note that if one were to focus on the literature and experience specifically of M&E of environmental peace building, it's relatively modest, very thin, in fact. And so we've been drawing on adjacent experiences. And what are experiences of managing environment, monitoring and evaluating environment, programming, development, humanitarian, and peace building programming. So ideally at the intersection, but sometimes we're drawing upon the broader body of knowledge. Next, please. The toolkit itself focuses on 4 main sections. We do have a primer that helps to provide some background information for those who aren't as familiar with environmental peace building, but it's really focusing on the project management process. So design of the project, including developing what your theory of change is, and what are your indicators, then the monitoring, the collection of the information, the review of it, the processing of it, evaluation. And this focuses more on project evaluations, but we do have a certain amount on programmatic evaluations, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then finally, the learning side of things. And throughout, we have discrete issues around gender, around privacy, around a lot of the interesting issues that cut across these themes, but we've tried to mainstream that into the toolkit. Next, please. So why is this important? So the big challenge, one of the things that we see is that we don't always have a good understanding of what the relationship between conflict, peace, and environmental outcomes is. We have ideas, but and we have ideas about how to fix it, but the question, or how to address it, how to navigate it, but we don't always have that knowledge. And so collecting that knowledge through the monitoring, synthesizing that knowledge through evaluation, then acting on it through learning, this is really important. There is a lot of work on the environment side. There's a lot of work on the conflict and peace side. The problem often comes in the intersections. How do we show that changes in environmental outcomes are related in any way to changes in the peace and conflict context? Secondly, one of the things that we see is that the operating environments where environmental peace building often takes place are volatile, and that the normal processes of having, say, quarterly reviews or yearly reviews, this is insufficient. That it's necessary to have a more dynamic process for monitoring and periodically evaluating. Another thing that I mentioned is the limited evidence. And then the fact is we're still relatively early in the process. Our hope is, so the limited evidence means that we've got a number of promising approaches and lessons, but the question is how effective are these? How universally applicable are they, or how much does it depend on the context? So this really is this is the start of a long-term discussion about how do you do monitoring, evaluation, and learning of environmental peace building. Next, please. So I would like to shift briefly now, if I may. Alex, I'd like to share my screen, if that's okay. So I should, okay, there we go. So I'd like to talk a little bit first about what is environmental peace building. There are a number of different ideas, and this is one of the exciting things about the field, that we are still very much developing our conceptualizations of what is environmental peace building. How does it work? What are the theories of change? Or is there a theory of change? So I want to start with that a little bit and then dive into the some of the specific questions around M&E of environmental peace building. So for our purposes, environmental peace building is the process of governing and managing natural resources and the environment to support durable peace. This is across the conflict life cycle, before, during, and after, as renewable resources, non-renewable resources, ecosystems and their services, including climate change. It works at multiple scales, internationally, nationally, locally. It includes violent conflict, armed conflict, and social conflict. And I think it's also important here for purposes of what we're talking about. It includes both the positive peace side of things and the negative peace, because there are some conceptualizations of environmental peace building that are very specifically focusing on cooperation, so on the positive peace side of things. We're looking more broadly at a range of activities that both address underlying drivers and sources of conflict, as well as building positive peace. And as such, environmental peace building is a meta framework that comprises multiple pathways and approaches. And I think this is important because each pathway has its own theory of change. And I think that with those theories of change, with those distinct theories of change, there are different metrics, there are different approaches, often tied to that particular pathway. Environmental peace building includes both the environmental dimensions of peace building and the peace and security dimensions of sustainable development. I'll talk briefly about each of those. The environmental dimensions of peace building, here you have the conflict life cycle. On the left is during or before conflict, and as grievances and tensions escalate, and then in conflict, and then peace making and the resolution of conflict and recovery. Along the top, we see ways that environment and natural resources are risks, whether it's the cause of conflict, financing conflict, incentive for peace spoilers. And underneath, we see the opportunities presented by environmental and natural resource considerations, including good governance as a means of conflict prevention, dialogue, livelihoods, economic incentives, and so forth. Next, please.
You have the slides, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. So we're also looking at the peace and security dimensions of sustainable development. And let me just pull this down here. Sorry. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, Goal 16 included peace as an element of the global sustainable development agenda. And this is really important because historically, sustainable development is viewed as a three-legged stool with each leg. One leg is environment, another is economic, the other is social. And for the first time, we have in the global UN framework, we really see peace as the fourth leg of sustainable development. That there can be no sustainable development without peace, there can be no peace without sustainable development. And with that, we also see that the Goal 16 is a cross-cutting issue. If you look at the targets and indicators for each of the different SDGs, you see a lot of these are linked to environmental peace building. And we see 8 of the SDGs have at least 70% synergy with environmental peace building. The other part of this, aside from the SDGs, is just generally, if you want to have sustainable development, you need to do it in a conflict-sensitive way, especially in fragile and conflict-affected settings. It's not just in those settings, but it becomes that much more important to project success. And we did an analysis with the Global Environment Facility and found that every single project, or I should say, every single indicator of project success was influenced by whether the project was in a situation of fragility. This is on average, but there's a statistically significant impact of fragility and conflict on project outcomes. And the interesting thing is, environmental organizations often do not have any sort of conflict-sensitive policies or guidelines or training or staff. And so you often see a blind spot where people, they're there to save the environment. They're there to protect climate change. They're there to help this community without necessarily understanding how their actions could exacerbate social cleavages or lead to conflict. So I think it's really important that that environmental peace building also recognize that there is a peace and security dimension to their work here. Another thing that I think is worth noting, many people are doing environmental peace building, even if they don't call it that. Some is fairly obvious, people working on climate security or environmental diplomacy or peace ecology, but there are a lot of other things that, because of the context, people are working on restoring livelihoods, agrarian livelihoods after conflict, and they're having to deal with land tenure and water rights and legacies of unexploded ordnance. And so we see a lot of people are working on these issues, even if they don't call it that. And so the key point here is these are actions that really are at the intersection of environment, conflict, and peace. Sometimes that's contextual, sometimes it is in a more deliberate way where somebody's trying to use environment for conflict transformation. Environmental peace building includes a range of techniques and methods that do 3 things. First is manage natural resources and other environmental issues to address grievances and to reduce illegal resource extraction that might further violence. So this is part of the negative piece. It's removing the sources of conflict, the drivers of conflict, and the means of financing conflict. It also supports livelihoods, economic recovery, gender equity, basic needs. And as such, it provides peace dividends, and it provides a foundation for sustainable peace. And third, and this is where a lot of people usually think of environmental peace building, environmental peace building also enables people to conceive shared environmental challenges as incentives for joint problem solving and trust building. I'll skip this for in the interest of time. I will say that there are a number of challenges, and what I want to put this out there now and move beyond it, because so often the focus right now, or has been, on what are the challenges? Why do we have these problems? What we've tried to do with the toolkit, and we'll talk about a number of these approaches later in the course, is focus on the solutions. How do you navigate this? But I think it's worth noting that fragile and conflict-affected operating environments are volatile. It makes it unsafe for staff. It makes it difficult to collect data, to analyze, to really understand what's happening. Secondly, the impacts are often only able to be ascertained over a long time horizon. And this can be difficult to capture at the end of a project when you're supposed to report. Third, multiple actors makes it difficult to ascertain, and not just actors, but also projects, makes it difficult to ascertain the impacts of specific interventions. And so one of the things that we're seeing is the shift from attribution, that is to say, did this project lead to a better outcome, to contribution. And we find that it's often fairly, we know how to track environmental change, environmental improvement. We know how to track changes in security, changes in trust, but it's really difficult to show how these things are linked, other than through narrative purposes. And those, I would say those four are inherent in environmental peace building. The fifth challenge, we create for ourselves. The fact is that many organizations only do M&E because the donor tells them to. They don't try to learn from it. In fact, there's often a desire to not really learn, because if you start asking questions about, did this work, you might get an answer you don't like. And so there's often a desire to just kind of keep moving, get the next grant in the door. And so this makes it difficult to really have the necessary investment of resources and commitment of staff. So the strategies that we've seen, use of early warning systems to as you monitor, if things get out of, start escalating, you can, you're not waiting for the quarterly or semi-annual evaluation. Adaptive management is essential in these situations, along with real-time evaluations. Having a dynamic theory of change, mixed methods. Some things you can quantify easily. How many people did you train? How many trees did you plant? But a lot of it is qualitative, and it's important to really think about what are the sources, and are there creative ways you can find the information, whether it's through qualitative or quantitative means. Programmatic evaluations, we're not going to talk about this a lot in this course, but we have some interesting material on this. This is important because often you have like a 2-year project, a 3-year project. And at the end of that, you report, and then you move on to the next project. But you're only really looking at the impacts of that project. You don't know what are the long-term impacts. You don't necessarily know what are the impacts between this project and other projects, or across sectors, or with other donors. And so programmatic evaluations are one way of taking this broader view. It's more difficult to do, in part because often you can have an element, a portion of your project funding for a project evaluation, but programmatic evaluation requires a separate source of funding. But the programmatic evaluations that we've seen have been very interesting, and that really helps on the learning side. And then the other is institutionalizing learning. And I think Shehla will talk about that more. And with that, before we move on to the next, to the exercise, do people have any questions?
And if you do have a question, feel free to just unmute and speak it out.
Okay, do we want to set up the exercise then?
Sure. So the first exercise we're going to do, which I've just shared a link in the chat to a description of it, and please let me know if that link does not work. Google Docs loves to switch around permissions on you, I found. But the idea is that we're going to do what I'm calling a personas exercise. So we're going to think about monitoring and evaluation and doing a monitoring and evaluation plan in the context of a certain project, which will be the same project we'll use for our next exercise. And we'll be thinking through what needs to go in a monitoring and evaluation plan, responding to how to do it, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which will be the next 3 topics we cover with a variety of stakeholders. So this is kind of a brainstorm, get our minds working about what monitoring and evaluation looks like to different groups of people. And so we'll go into breakout rooms. You have a short description of the case, a very overly simplified description of the case. I'm hoping there's no South Sudanese experts in here who will critique my simplification. And we'll work through some of these questions and just really get thinking about this topic. I'm assuming the link works. If nobody said it doesn't. Awesome. Okay. So shall we do our breakout rooms? How much time do we have, Shehla?
These should be about 20 minutes, I believe. Yes.
Great.
Okay, so I'll be starting breakout rooms.
1 second. Jill, do you have a question? Sorry, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, sorry. I have a couple of parameter questions as we're filling
Sure.
this out. Are we doing this from the perspective of we are the large donor trying to find a NGO or otherwise that's doing conservation in South Sudan? Or are we an implementer in South Sudan who's applying for this kind of funding?
So I've written that we're the M&E people for the project itself. So we could be funded by the funder or that group of organizations that are implementing. I didn't really specify, but from the standpoint of we're the monitoring and evaluation folks who are about to write this plan, but we have to keep in mind all of these other groups.
Sure. So I guess then the reason I'm asking the question is like trying to get an idea of the scope for M&E, because if we are the donor, then we would have several indicators and otherwise to reach these goals that we're trying to think through. But if we're an implementer, then we might have other tracking in mind.
That's exactly the point of this exercise. What you're getting at right now is that different groups will have different needs and wants from this. And you're already 5 steps ahead of everyone. And thinking through how this might be different. No, that's great. That your mind is right in the right place. I hope I get to be in your group. Okay, Alex, I think he's moving us.
Welcome back, everyone. We'd like to do a brief report back, and I'm wondering if I see Eric up on the screen there, so maybe start with Eric's group.
Sure. Great. Well, thanks very much. We had a conversation. We were a very small group. There were 3 of us. And so we, had a chance to look at a few things. A couple of insights. Monitoring versus evaluation was an issue that, we are talking about an M&E plan, but that kind of monitoring requirements and evaluation requirements and processes and resources and the timeliness of the type of information that's generated are very different. Potentially, maybe some overlap, but also very different. And that the monitoring itself would be very project specific. The evaluation could help elevate, the evaluative side could help elevate some key insights that would be applicable to future project design. And so a few points around that needed to be highlighted. We also, and that really also brings up the point that the indicators to be used in monitoring and those to be used in evaluative processes are not always, well, we would need to account for the complexity of preparing that given the diversity of the stakeholders and tailoring the indicators to the needs of the different stakeholders. The question of trust, I think, came up a lot for us, given that this is environmental peace building related work, and that even in data collection processes for a project like this related to M&E, we would need to ensure that there was trust built into the process of data collection, and that identifying stakeholders to participate in that, trusted by all, would be really critical and could be challenging in conflict environments. So do not take, the trust and our role, if you will, as the funder, as the project for granted within all of this. So a kind of a reflexive perspective. Stop me when you want me to stop. I could keep going here with a variety of different insights. Maybe another one or two would be the challenge of capacity and commitment to realize reporting in a timely way to different communities. If there are different communities, different language groups, different geographic concentrations, and the commitments that we make to report back to different communities in formats that are culturally, regionally, linguistically appropriate can be very timely. We don't always see that those resources are made available to do that, or that capacities are deployed, in fact, to do that to all the different stakeholders, not only on the ground, but to all in a timely way. And let's see, I think that probably, just keeping in mind the interests of the different groups at all times will be important, so that we don't also create new conflicts, because even in designing M&E processes, we can include and exclude different communities and knowledge holders, and that can have impact on conflict and peace cooperative dynamics. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Erica.
Thanks so much. We were just starting to really let this scenario seep into our consciousness. So we got pulled out a little bit early. We were just hitting a groove. But, talked about address two questions out of that list. And in terms of the stakeholder dynamics there, discussed the need to construct an M&E plan that does not create more conflict. In this case, we were concerned about the type of data that was being collected and whether or not, for example, if the government wanted to know who was poaching and where, and the communities did not want to divulge that because they might be involved, we've set up a challenging dynamic there. That would probably necessitate at the very beginning of the activity doing a needs-based assessment, looking at diet and alternatives and what the different motivations there could be. Also recognizing that the scenario posited us in a place where we were just coming out of a civil war, and that the ministry may not have the capacity and the expertise to be able to adequately engage in an M&E plan, and may need to outsource a lot of this activity, or would need alternatively to have capacity building measures in place to rebuild those structures internally. We also discussed about the need to, sorry, just looking through my notes here. Of course, the funders require this information in order to justify the expenditure, but ensuring if those funders are external to the situation, that they're not bringing in, a different culture or a different set of values and imposing them upon this particular setting. And I think lastly, recognizing that communities themselves have begun developing sets of indicators of progress towards these goals, and ensuring that that can be part of a transparency and accountability process in delivering the M&E plan. So I think those are the main points. If there are others in the group that would like to advocate for additional insights, but we have a whiteboard where we captured all of this.
Well, thank you. Amanda.
I actually was in Erica's room since the way it got split up originally. Bootcat and I were just by ourselves, so I moved to their room.
Okay. Shehla.
You're always muted. You got to remember, you're always muted. I think a lot of the key themes that came up in our room were very similar to the ones in Eric's and Erica's. So a few things that I think really stood out to me is one, approaching the development of the M&E plan with an understanding and an instinct to collect information on the needs, goals, and perspectives of these different stakeholder groups. In this case, particularly focusing on the communities and their relationship perhaps with the government, with the poachers, and trying to get a sense of what these relationship dynamics are between the different groups. And one conversation that led us to was very similarly to Erica, when there is kind of a tension between these different stakeholder groups, how do we figure out what information is safe to collect? How do we figure out what information is safe to share? How do we maintain the privacy of certain folks while still maintaining, the project's objectives and maintaining a good relationship with each of the partners we're working with? And to that information, kind of in a different direction, we also spoke about, how you can go to different partners to gain access to different resources or to different types of information, and also figuring out and considering the ethics of using different particular data collection systems in that process, and balancing all of these different considerations in a way that is beneficial to everyone. And right towards the end, we also spoke a little bit about how you can even measure, what's beneficial to who and when, and how to, balance those needs reasonably. And of course, if anyone in the group would like to add to that, please jump in.
Okay, our group was, it's interesting listening to others because I feel like our group is a little jaded. The idea of talking to each, to all of the different groups and kind of getting an understanding with them, that's a great idea. But we had a number of rather skeptical or cautionary errors or threads that went through our discussion. One of them was that as a general matter, I think there's agreement that everyone sees the M&E plan as a way to understand what happened. Okay, that's so far so good, but not everyone wants to have other people know what happened. If it's a failure, you might want to know it's not so good, but you probably already know that. And you certainly don't want the funder or the communities to know that it was deemed problematic. Or that, and part of this also comes to the conflict narrative, that a lot of the conflict stories have very clear narratives about, the facts about the world. And if the project does not align with that narrative, you can have real problems. And so even just understanding what you should track depends on which narrative you place how much weight on. And so it's not saying that there's disagreement. It's just I think that there's some interesting tensions there. There's also there's a desire for people to show success stories, not so much on the failure, wanting to justify the work, accountability. There are questions, different perceptions, but there are questions and concerns about corruption, and wanting to make sure that M&E in part is trying to transparency and reduce corruption, but where there might be corruption, there can be concerns about how that gets shared. And then one of the really interesting things was that as you develop a better understanding of the peace and conflict dynamics, often you need to develop new indicators to better track what's changing. And so I thought we have talked about the need for dynamic monitoring and kind of revisiting the indicators, but I think it's that's a particularly important observation. And the final one, going back to my opening comment, is that often there is there is no common goal, and it can be difficult to get a common goal. And so if you don't have that shared commonality, it may be difficult to evaluate in a way that all the stakeholders either agree with or find credible. And so I'll pause there. Were there any other groups that we haven't heard from? Anybody else in my group like to intervene or clarify anything I said? Okay, Amanda, over to you.
Thank you. And Alex, we can get our slide deck back up. So I'm pretty impressed with what came out of that exercise. It was sort of a gamble trying that out with you all. And I know that some people in my group were like, I'm not an M&E person, but ended up having really great insights. So I think that got the juices flowing for what we're going to cover next, which is monitoring. Once we get those slides up.
Just give me 1 second, almost.
Sure. Great, and I think it starts, yep, and you can go ahead to the next slide, Alex. So first of all, the point came up, right? Monitoring and evaluation are different things. So what is monitoring? Really, there are a lot of definitions. Anyone you ask would give you something that's slightly different, but I think the idea is that it's an ongoing process of collecting, analyzing, and using information to guide and improve our project or program. Great, I get that. But how do I actually do that? What does that look like? The first thing is decide what information is important to ask. When I'm working with people that really don't have a lot of M&E experience, or they're not really sure what monitoring is, the most basic question is, how do we know, right? You want to do something, you want something to happen from that. How do you know that that's the case? How do you know that you achieved your objectives? How do you know that your activity or the things that you had planned were implemented? That's where we can start. The next step is we need to get a little bit specific. And this came up, I can't remember who said it in our debrief just now, but they said something about benefiting whom and how. when we're doing monitoring, we want to get really clear on what the outputs and outcomes, to use some M&E speak, what those look like and what we're going to collect. So if I'm thinking about, for example, improving livelihoods or having less conflicts or improving water quality, these things may seem pretty straightforward, but then when I go to collect data, I might encounter some issues, like what kind of job equates to a livelihood? Does the person need to make a certain amount of money? Do they need to have the job for a certain amount of time? If I'm thinking about conflict, what kinds of conflicts am I talking about? Does it have to be violent conflict? What about non-violent conflict? At what scale? Or even things like water quality. If I'm saying, okay, I want to increase water quality or improve water quality, who's deciding what's good enough? How is that defined? You know, I may be using some international standard, but maybe the community doesn't feel like the water is good enough. And those are two different ways of looking at things. So when we're thinking about monitoring and you're deciding what you want to collect information on, it's important to be specific. The next thing is considering the context. And this, you guys tackled this all in your groups. I could hear from the report out. What information is it even possible for you to collect in this context? Is it potentially going to cause conflict by you collecting information? In our group, we had the great example of, I want to collect information on poaching, but that may actually produce conflicts between the ministry and the community. And then another reason to consider the context is to actually monitor the context, because things may be happening outside of our project's control that we need to be monitoring, even if it's not, you know, part of our activities or the objectives that we're going to be looking at. The next one is about right-sizing our approach. I work with a lot of people who think, I can't do M&E. We don't have enough resources. We don't have a team. I don't have, you know, access to great technology or whatever the case may be. You can always do something. You just need to right-size it. So also in our group, we talked about, well, what if we're working with the ministry and they don't have a lot of resources? Let's scale it down. Let's refocus. Let's bring in some partners. That's something to consider when you're thinking about doing monitoring. We also have triangulation. So environmental peacebuilding initiatives inherently have multiple stakeholders and multiple dynamics. That's what makes them so complex, as Carl mentioned at the beginning. That's what can make it sort of daunting to do M&E for them. The important part here to triangulate is to make sure that we're capturing monitoring from a lot of different perspectives and getting a really full picture. And then be as participatory as possible. I'm sure most of you have heard this already, that we should be participatory in our design. We should be participatory in our programs. We should bring in stakeholders. You know, we considered multiple stakeholders in this last exercise. The added benefit of this is what some of the groups mentioned, but it's building trust. You know, you have to have the trust, but being participatory can also build the trust and improve the monitoring information that you're getting, and also probably improve project outcomes depending on how you do it. However, as other groups mentioned, you can't just be participatory and say, this is great, it's working out for us, I'm including people, so that's that. You have to think about how they're being included. And if we look up above to triangulation, being participatory allows us to do that. Next slide, Alex. So if we're thinking about key monitoring considerations, and Carl covered some of these at the beginning, but I think it's worth revisiting them. The first one, and we talked about this in our group, and I'd be interested to hear from others if they talked about it in their group, is an over-reliance on set quantitative indicators. I don't know if anyone feels comfortable raising their hand in real life or with the reactions on Zoom, but how many people have worked on a project that totally relied on quantitative indicators that were set at the very beginning? Okay, I've seen some brave reactions there. This is very common, unfortunately. And environmental peace building in particular is not really well served by this, what I'm going to call a traditional approach to doing monitoring, with very fixed logic models or theories of change that have probably too many quantitative indicators that really aren't telling you the context. And Osman brought this up in our group when we were talking about poaching, is let's say we're only counting the number of animals that are poached and the number of poaching incidences. That may not tell us that actually this particular species, a lot of people rely on it for food in their diet. And so we may think, oh, these people are bad, they're poachers. But really, when we get more context in our monitoring, we understand why that's happening. And so these kinds of dynamics or changes over time are really not captured if we're thinking about, you know, one quantitative indicator, here's another quantitative indicator and another one. The second piece is prioritizing certain information or ways of knowing. So when we're thinking about our monitoring system, how might we be intentionally, unintentionally, likely unintentionally, prioritizing certain ways of knowing? You may be looking at experts in environmental issues or on peace building, or you may be overemphasizing the community. I wouldn't say that happens very much, but you know, there are ways that when you're doing monitoring, you may be getting mostly one side of the picture. And why this is important beyond just, you know, making sure you have the full picture is going back to that piece about participation. If you aren't involving people, these different stakeholders, let's think about our case, the ministry, the community, the funder, if you're not involving those folks and bringing in their perspective, these are people that can either support you or they can potentially sabotage you. And I've seen that in some environmental peace building projects where certain parts of a community weren't brought in, they weren't asked for their knowledge, they weren't included. And when the project was put into place, they intentionally sabotaged it. Not because they were bad people or, you know, had very devious plans, but because they didn't really understand it, because no one bothered to bring them in. And so that's a really important thing to think about as well. You know, participation, though, as I mentioned before, is not always easy in these complex contexts in which environmental peace building is taking place. There's a lot of dynamics. It's very, it's rooted in a lot of different systems. So it's therefore more complicated. And each of your groups kind of came up with these questions about, well, how do we engage people? What are they all going to think of as valid information or as showing, you know, from a funder side that this project is paying off for us, or on a community side, this project is actually providing benefits for us. So people will have different opinions about what information is valid. You know, if I come to a community and say, hey, this scientific body has decided this water quality is good, if they don't feel like it is, you know, that scientific expert doesn't really matter. That's not a valid source of information for them. They may instead rely on certain people in their own community or look to their own government representative or any number of cases, but it's important to think through that piece of it, what people are seeing as valid sources of information. And as I kind of touched on, the optics of how we collect information, of how we ask people to participate, can impact that conflict context. You know, if I'm inviting this group to give me feedback or to collect data from me versus this other group, that could negatively impact the conflict context. And the point I think Eric's group was mentioning about trust and who you're deciding will get this information for you, you have to think that through in these in these situations? How does that look to other people? Is that someone that they trust? Or will they immediately see this project as invalid because that person isn't in their, they're not someone that they trust? Even just thinking about logistics, you know, inviting people, oh, I really want to be participatory. I want to collect this monitoring data from you and ask you to look at it with me. Can you even bring everyone into the same room? Is that okay to do? Will that cause problems in and of itself? So thinking through all of these pieces and going to what Carl talked a little bit about at the beginning about monitoring in an insecure context. Is it even safe to do anything like this? Do people feel safe providing the information? Is it risky for you as an M&E person to go out there and collect the information? If I'm really transparent, which we all think is a good thing, does that put certain people at risk when I'm doing my monitoring? I think what we've come up with is in talking to people that we've talked to as part of this project is maybe you have to think through this and you have to have a contingency plan in place. So kind of like, well, what if this happens? What's our next step? And also making sure that your own staff, let's say you work for the implementing organization or a partner organization, that your staff are trained or that you can work with local community members. I thought I saw a hand and then it disappeared. Okay.
Yeah, that was me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
Did
just
you have a quick question or point? Yeah.
just kind of reinforcing the importance of monitoring. There was a natural gas plant that was built in Afghanistan, and it turned out to be not so environmentally great because it didn't really do anything. It didn't replace. It wasn't getting enough use. So this is an example when monitoring would reveal what works, what doesn't work, and that's how you can correct it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that ties back into the idea that monitoring and evaluation are different. And monitoring, you should be doing that throughout the project or program so that you can potentially spot things that aren't working from the beginning or from whenever it happens. And you're not waiting until the end of your 2-year project when you fully built, in this case, I guess, a plant, or you fully developed something that you realize is not working. And that was a lot of wasted effort and wasted money and potentially wasted trust that you had built with that community. Yeah. Alex, you can go to the next slide. So indicators, before we go into our next exercise, Carl mentioned this at the beginning, the biggest thing we continue to see over and over again in this work is how are we capturing both environment and peace and conflict, as well as the interaction between them. We've seen a lot of different projects that may have lots of environmental indicators or lots of peace and conflict indicators, but maybe they don't have both. And often, because it is so challenging, there isn't a good way of looking at them together. So we have a hard time understanding how do these things interact with one another. Some other things to think about as we're considering our indicators for monitoring is I'm saying the extra important difference between qualitative and quantitative. I think that's always important, but in environmental peace building, it feels extra important because these interventions are really combining more of the natural sciences with people's attitudes and beliefs and behaviors in a way that maybe other kinds of projects don't. So the need to have all different kinds of indicators, like the example I gave before about poaching, I feel like is indeed extra important. Another thing is need versus want. M&E people talk about that a lot. If we have limited resources, which we almost always do, and limited time, focus on what we really need to know and what's not just nice to know or I kind of want to know. And again, I think this is extra important in the environmental peace building context because we do often have security issues The context is complex. We have limited resources. We have multiple partners. We don't want to overburden people. It's an extra important consideration. We also talk about leading indicators, which show the first sign of change or progress and are often used as an early warning system for potentially other things that are on the horizon. And these can be important both because of the conflict context. We want to avoid conflict or increasing conflict as much as possible, but also to get back to that issue about long time horizons. Maybe we won't see the thing we're really going for quite a while, but we might have a leading indicator that's showing us that there's progress towards it. Context indicators, I mentioned this briefly before when we were talking about the importance of monitoring the context. What do I need to look for in this larger context or situation that I'm operating in that could affect the work that I'm doing? Not just sticking to the logic model and or the theory of change and those indicators, but what else risks and assumptions do I need to check? And then one particular toolbox of things is complexity aware monitoring, which is of course useful in complex contexts where cause and effect might either be difficult to predict or understand, or where things are changing a lot and where adaptive management might be useful. Having something where you're synchronizing your monitoring to the pace of change. You're not saying, oh, I'm going to collect this every quarter. You're saying, I'm going to collect this information when it happens. And I'm going to be responsive to the change that's happening. Complexity aware monitoring also involves intentionally looking for unintended outcomes, as well as alternative reasons for your intended outcomes. Looking at relationships and perspectives, which we talked a lot about in the participation and the triangulation, but being really intentional and getting different stakeholder feedback. And we're going to talk a little bit more about complexity aware evaluation when we get to evaluation, but these are some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about indicators, which will be our next breakout.
All right, folks. So like Amanda did earlier, I'm going to drop a little link in the chat for you all to our indicators exercise worksheet. And likewise, if anyone is seeing that the link is not working, please let us know, but hopefully should be. And again, we're going to break out into actually, I think, a smaller group or fewer groups this time, just because we are a smaller group and we want to have, you all have the opportunity to meet a couple of different people today. So this returns us to the project that we talked about in our last exercise. And we've given to you the theory of change, the major objectives of the project, and 3 of the main indicators that they use. And so there's some questions to guide you through discussion in terms of these indicators and how you might improve upon them as a group. So with that, Alex, I think if you'd like to take us into 3 breakout rooms this time, we'll go for 17 minutes just because we're starting to run a little bit over.
I might suggest that while we're waiting, take advantage of the time and read through the document. We had some reading as we were in the breakout rooms. And so this is a great chance to read through the indicators and start thinking about them and hit the ground running in the breakout rooms.
Give me just 2 seconds, almost there.
Of course.
Everyone left got an invitation. No. Alex, perhaps. Oh, there we go.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, Anna, I put you in a group where with one extra person, so it's okay. You can stay here without issue.
Perfect. Ollie, it looks like you were assigned to room 1.
Alex, I think you forgot to stop recording for breakout rooms.
Wonderful. So I think we can go ahead and move into our report back. We're in 3 groups this time. So Eric, I don't know if you'd like to start by sharing the takes from our room.
You know, I grew up with the last name Abitbol, which meant I always went first, no matter what happened, until people started getting creative and saying we could start from the end of the alphabet. So it was 50% of the time, sure, I'd be happy to go first. Well, you know, a lot was shared, and there were, you know, a lot of ideas that circulated. So I'm just going to make a few key points and see what we can do. Having enough time for developing indicators is really important because of the complexity of what we're talking about here and the processes required for indicator development. We noticed that the indicators were not actually related to the conflict dimension, and it was important to do that in ways that looked at, you know, resilience, reconciliation, other points. Making sure that the data we're collecting is actually really relevant data, because it can be, you know, we can collect so much data that we might actually be missing the point of the data that's really necessary. So making sure that we're also pitching our data collection and indicator development at the right level. These are quantitative metrics, and they left little room for qualitative methodologies. Some of these are monitoring and others are evaluative indicators. So we distinguish between the two. To be frank, it wasn't clear if we were being asked to look at impacts, but in fact, it wasn't clear if we were developing immediate, intermediate, longer term outcome indicators. And so the difference between the activities that were defined and what we thought were more objectives or priorities of a project were not clear. You know, it wasn't clear what improved meant. And so we wanted to be clear that, or we thought it would be important to actually identify metrics of kind of value and meaning as we wrote, we developed the indicators. Let's see, quite a few other things, figuring out the intervals of data collection and matching those intervals with particular methods, whether it was satellite data or focus group discussions. The intervals are very different and the indicators are very different. We can build environmental peace building into a data collection system where if we have a reference group for monitoring, and in fact, and even indicator development, that could be group from the different parties themselves, and in fact building trust into the design and processes of the system that we're developing. Trust in the data that is used to report with was an issue, given we have a diversity of stakeholders. There was some concern about interaction between the government and private sector, you know, and that touches on agreements, it touches on the integrity of that information. We also talk about the perception of communities. And so having indicators that might even reflect perceptions of communities on trust, progress, integrity, while also building in programmatic guardrails. I guess the two last points are again related to the quality of the data that's collected, because not all data is of the same quality, and again, how much information we use, and that we can draw in data from international organizations like on biodiversity, the IUCN Red List, etc., while also being aware of the way in which conservation organizations have historically fed into some communities and the kind of political economy within which they are operating with the language of conservation. Whew, that was the best I could do.
And it was great, very comprehensive. I think you touched on all the big points.
Hey, well, we had a great group.
All right. Yes, definitely. Good conversation. Erica, would you like to go next?
Definitely. Hard act to follow there. We had a lot of similar conversation about the lack of indicators relevant to conflict and peace. That the indicators themselves really needed better definition. That there were a lot of assumptions baked in, like the number of people with increased economic benefit might be related to, a healthier, more sustainable community, but who is defining that? So there's a lot missing regarding the risk of conflict, whether that conflict is decreasing or being further exacerbated. The patrols, are they supported? Are they having run-ins with people? What are the outcomes of those run-ins? Is the frame too narrow? We only have 4 stakeholder groups involved. Are we missing other entities that have remote relationship to this, that, by addressing this small scope and vision, that we might be creating conflict elsewhere? Excuse me. That, they are all numeric, they're metric. There's no address of the people's experiential activity as part of this process. How is the collaboration between community and private industries being framed? Is that improving? How do we get at some of the more intangible here, and balancing out this? Does the number of kilometers patrolled, does that translate into some sort of goal that's set about, that's not explicitly outlined in the activities for the project? And let's see, just relating this to, as it was mentioned, 2 sides of this activity, that you have a producer, and then you have a receiver. So in this case, the wildlife, are they being well supported? Are they being impacted by factors not at all framed here? Natural disasters, soil quality, predator-prey relationships that have nothing to do with poaching. And then the other side of it, the people that perhaps rely on this source of protein for their livelihoods. So definitely there was a lot wanting. We didn't get to pencil and paper of actually rewriting them into our wish list, but certainly there was a lot that was lacking in the indicators. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Erica. And I think that just leaves Carl's group. Carl, you were muted there.
Sorry about that. We had a very interesting discussion, especially in contrast to the other 2 groups. I think that there were some areas of commonality, but along 3 fronts at least, there was a reluctance to propose indicators because we needed to understand better. We needed to understand what exactly are the proposed activities. Is it capacity building? Is it legal development? Is it providing equipment? What exactly are we doing? And even more fundamentally, really understanding the problems. Why is there poaching? Who is poaching? If you increase their livelihoods, will that stop the poaching, or will that simply be used as money for other purposes? So better understanding the drivers and the context. And then the other, whether the intervention was the right intervention. There were questions about, is this really the right thing to do? Which is maybe beyond the scope of the M&E staff member, but there were some, but if you're looking at, say, the non-economic aspects of these activities. There's an assumption that this is only economic. There's a social aspect. Should we be looking more at some of the conflict resolution or conflict transformation? How does this tie to local governance? And so there was a lot of desire for more information. There were a few very specific comments on the indicators. One, there wasn't really anything about the peace impacts. There was a desire for not just total miles, but say issues of rate. You know, is there a consistency? How many kilometers per day or per week? There was a desire to better understand how rangers relate to the power and conflict dynamics, and who are the poachers. The last thing that I think is was interesting from my side was that the people have seen worse indicators. You know, we looked at all of this and went, okay, there's this problem, this problem, this problem, and this, you know, we've seen worse. So it is interesting to kind of have that reality check. Oh, sorry, the last point that I really wanted to flag, I think there was some tension in some of the comments between what is feasible in monitoring and evaluation and what is necessary. And there was a sense that some things may be necessary but not feasible, or they're feasible if the funder is willing to spend a lot more money or do things differently, but the funder may not be willing to do that. And so kind of this question of this tension between feasibility and, well, you really need to do X, Y, and Z. And second point is, as you think about the different sources of data, the best sources are the ones that you trust, that you're not responsible for, that you don't have to pay for. You could just feed them in. But a lot of the relational dynamics, those sorts of data do not exist. So as you dive into the sorts of things that we were talking about, that's going to largely fall on the actual cost of the project and on that particular funder. So anybody, we had a lot of different perspectives. I don't know if I captured everything. Please feel free to jump in, anybody from our group. Okay.
All right. So with that, I believe it is time for us to take our break. Very well deserved. Everyone's brains have been moving. Alex, if you want to put up the slide with the break, that would be perfect. You should all be back here in 10 minutes. So that would be 3:49 Eastern. And we'll see you then.
intentional. Awesome. Be participatory. I continue to mention that because I think it's so important because it gives you that fuller picture. It's also recognizes the fact that evaluation is part of an intervention and can have implications as part of an intervention. And really important for the evaluation, participation often increases a sense of ownership of the results, of the learnings that come out of the evaluation, and more often than not will lead to, or more often than non-participatory approaches can help with the implementation of those lessons learned, actually using the results of the evaluation. And then the next thing to think about for evaluation of environmental peace building is alternative approaches. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about a couple of those and a second after we consider key considerations for evaluation. So Alex, we can go to the next slide. So a couple of things. The first one is my favorite to talk about, I have a lot of strong feelings, is contribution versus attribution. Contribution is how a project or program is one piece of a puzzle leading to an outcome or outcomes, whereas attribution, we seek to establish a direct causal relationship between what we're doing and what happened. Attribution often means something like a counterfactual, which I keep referencing randomized control trials or RCTs. And these are studies where you have a treatment group and a control group. So in the treatment group, they receive the treatment or your intervention. The control group is just there as the control. They don't receive the intervention, so they're there for comparison. And this is almost impossible to find in a real world situation, especially in one as complex as environmental peace building. And really more importantly, it's better to be clear about what you're looking to find and be realistic about that than trying to say, well, I really need to show attribution. If you're working in a complex context, go for the contribution if that's really all you can hope for. The long time horizons, we've mentioned a few times that both the changes in both environment and conflict, especially deeply rooted conflict, which is a lot of it, takes a lot of time. And in fact, immediate actions that you might take to address the conflict or to kind of stop the devastation of an environmental problem, they don't often address root causes and can even exacerbate them. So doing a long-term evaluation can be really helpful in these contexts. However, they're not often funded. You know, a project ends and your money ends. And so you don't have the funding to do an evaluation. So this is where, again, planning ahead, where either maybe you can ask, do we have more time to spend at least this part of the money? You can collaborate in advance with groups to do some kind of evaluation that gets at this long time horizon together. You can think about less resource intensive methods. There are a few ways of addressing this. Evaluating for learning. This seems like it should be obvious. And I won't ask anyone to raise their hand, but let's just say that sometimes evaluation reports are produced to sit on shelves and to meet donor requirements. So making sure that your evaluation in environmental peace building is really actually built for learning what those different stakeholders want to know. And as Carl mentioned at the very beginning, there's not a lot of information out there about environmental peace building and about the M&E of environmental peace building. So the more we can all kind of contribute to that, building that evidence base, the better. And then the impact of evaluation on the context. So I mentioned before, evaluation as intervention, in fact, M&E as intervention. The evaluation process and the findings can affect the context in which you're working in potentially unanticipated ways. So we've heard examples of how demonstrating peace dividends from a project can actually encourage a group to put in extra effort to sabotage it because they don't want peace for whatever reason. They're benefiting from a situation that is not peaceful. So if I share that, oh yeah, this is working, this is great, that might encourage someone else to try and sabotage the work. So just keeping in mind how those evaluation findings can and should be shared, balancing transparency with security and other elements of accountability, which we've all sort of hit on in our various conversations. So I will leave you with just 3, if you want to go to the next slide, Alex, potential evaluation approaches. And we don't have time to go into these, but I think that they are very interesting for these contexts, and I encourage you to dig into them a little bit more beyond this session to figure out what might be a possibility for your work. The first is developmental evaluation, which means that evaluative thinking is embedded throughout the project or program cycle. So sort of doing it in a mini way throughout the work. You're getting real-time feedback. You're maybe testing quick iterations of different approaches to your project, to your activities. It's often very participatory. So instead of an external consultant being hired to do your evaluation, it's really the team working together on this. And you're able to measure changes over time, but also quickly. So you're keeping up with the context. The next one is outcome harvesting, which is often used in situations where there aren't really set predetermined outcomes or where there are likely to be many different unknown outcomes. And I think that's very applicable to the environmental peacebuilding context. The users of the evaluation in this approach ask questions and generate what are called outcome statements that describe how change happens. And the focus is often on behavior change linked to relationships and policies and practices. So there's a lot of literature out there on outcome harvesting, and I think it's becoming more and more popular because it's not requiring us to follow very rigid theories of change. It's capturing unintended outcomes, and it could be a good approach for your project. And then the last one I'll mention is the most significant change approach, which is a participatory process where stakeholders describe the most important outcomes of a project. And then those stories are assessed for significant changes. So it's very much subjective. It's very much participatory and getting feedback from different kinds of stakeholders. And I think, as we were discussing our case today and the indicators, and moving away from very quantitative numbers indicators that weren't focused on outcomes, something like outcome harvesting or most significant change could allow you to see how things happened and what changed and how that was seen from the variety of the viewpoints of the variety of different stakeholders that were involved. So I just wanted to mention those because I think they're really interesting. And I encourage you to dig into them more. And Shehla, I will pass it on to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Alex, if we could get the next slide, perfect. So, hi everyone. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about learning. I do apologize. We're going to have to abridge our conversation on learning a little bit to leave some time for discussion at the end. But the reason I don't feel as bad about it is we just did a great full session on learning at PeaceCon, which we will send a link to all participants today, so you can kind of dig in more deeply. But with that, if we could get the next slide. I'd love to just start by defining what we mean when we say M&E for learning. So really this touches on monitoring and evaluation strategies, which are designed for the purpose of capturing information that can be used for future improvement. So kind of touching upon what Amanda's just said, like evaluation for learning, you do actually have to go with some intentionality to be really trying to seize on the information you need to make improvements in the future. Next slide. So how is this different from other forms of monitoring and evaluation? I would say that historically, most M&E we see is conducted actually for accountability. So accountability monitoring and evaluation tends to be more focused on giving accountability to funders. It may sometimes be targeted more at communities and other stakeholders, but largely funders tend to be the primary audience. It's focused on ensuring that project objectives and planned milestones are being met. It tends to focus on highlighting, accounting for project inputs and highlighting project outputs. And the scope is generally quite limited to that single intervention in the evaluation report, as compared to monitoring and evaluation for learning, which generally aims to provide information to the project staff, to the implementing organization, and also to other practitioners in the field, is a bit more communicative in its findings. It tends to focus a lot more on capturing processes. And as we said, it's for the purpose of encouraging those adjustments for future programs and projects. So the data that it mentions tends to be more focused on how things led to other things as opposed to what exactly has happened. And for that reason, the learning tends to be a little bit more connected with other interventions. As Amanda was speaking about a little bit earlier, we're looking to build the evidence base. And so that kind of calls upon things that have been done in the past and also looks forward in recommendations for things that we can do in the future. Next slide, please. And so I want to talk a little bit more just about the benefits of taking a learning approach to your monitoring and evaluation. So there's 4 major categories here. First of all, improving practices at the program, organization, and discipline-wide levels. So we can use information to inform our next project proposals if we're gathering that information in the projects we're doing right now. Not only that, but once we have that information, we can also consider how different organizational strategies have enabled particular outcomes, and we can adjust those strategies to help adjust outcomes in the future. And if we are willing to share that information out beyond our organizations to a wider audience, others can use our findings to improve their work for their future proposals and for their organizations. In terms of building the evidence base, as Carl said right at the beginning of the session, environmental peace building is still quite new and the boundaries of it are not perfectly defined. And so the more we can get literature in this field and to build out what we're doing is really helpful. So having an M&E approach that helps us gather information that assesses the accuracy of theories of change that are predominant in the field, and also helps us to test new approaches and see what works in practice in the field. In terms of managing unintended consequences, if we're focusing our energy on capturing processes, that can really be helpful as we're looking backwards and trying to figure out how unintended consequences have come about. If we can look to our processes, we can kind of see that chain of events a little bit more clearly and hopefully help to manage them better in future interventions. And then lastly, I'll touch on how it's useful just outside of our field as well. So not only can it illuminate information for other environmental peace building folks, but it can also be helpful to folks in adjacent fields. So for example, an environmental conservation organization might come upon an evaluation from an environmental peace building project. And from that, they can learn how they can incorporate peace building processes into their work as well. And not only that, but it can inform changes in the larger institutional operating environment as well. So when funders are seeing these reports across their different projects or from other organizations, that can influence the policy or strategic decision-making at those institutions. So next slide. And of course, we want to talk a little bit more about how we can do it. So first, I want to just acknowledge that learning is an active process. So it's not just happening when you're reviewing the project report, it's not just happening when you're reviewing data, but it's actually happening throughout the project cycle, from the minute you're designing your M&E strategy to the time you're going through it as you're approaching your next project. And so I think it's very important that we identify intervention points in the program cycle and ask questions throughout each part. So if you look at your screen, I've actually borrowed a graphic from one of our advisory group members, Jessica Baumgardner-Zuzik at the Alliance for Peace Building, that exemplifies the types of questions you can ask at each phase to facilitate more active learning. I can't go into too much detail here just because of time, but what I'll start with saying is just a couple of questions that I think are particularly important are looking at the design phase. So starting a project proposal and asking yourself, what have we learned previously? Trying to assess, what have others learned about this, and looking out for that, the reports that other people have put out in similar projects. That helps to facilitate the cycle and this community of learning amongst all of us. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, I do really recommend if you check out the PeaceCon video. Jessica did quite a long presentation on that graphic that I think is helpful. So the key actions we want to talk about for moving forward is, first of all, as has been a big theme throughout the whole training, is you really want to go into your design process with a lot of intentionality when you're figuring out your M&E strategy. So, thinking ahead, not just to the end of this project, but also to your future programming, to your strategic planning, when you are designing your M&E plan for any project, trying to figure out not only what information is helpful, as we saw in the indicators exercise, for your particular project, but also what information is helpful across projects, what information will be necessary and nice to look back at when we're trying to see change over a long period of time and tackling those long time horizons. Also figuring out how we can be critical and be interrogating our theories of change. That is very important to building the evidence base, and that really does start out with figuring out what questions and what indicators you're going to be using at the beginning of your process. And then lastly, as we've mentioned already, being able to capture processes as well as outcomes, being able to look back and see what exactly we've done and how it traces to things that have happened. Even if we can't necessarily confirm attribution, it is helpful to see how these things put together. Next, using evaluations to create recommendations for future action. Evaluation reports are a great opportunity to assess gaps in your strategy, assess gaps in that project, and to build recommendations for either your organization, for future project staff, or just for other practitioners in the field approaching similar interventions. So you can also use this as an opportunity to start a conversation with your organization about enacting those recommendations or about building processes for checking in on learning over time after, at different parts of the year, reviewing the recommendations you've put together, seeing if you've enacted them, seeing what progress you've made, and building those accountability mechanisms. Next is increasing communication and transparency between organizations and widening the dissemination of evaluation reports. The whole learning process is very dependent on us being able to gain the information from other folks. As Amanda said, so many evaluations just kind of are published for the funder, they sit on the shelf, and we really want to avoid that because there's a lot of really great and important information. Someone can take away a lot from someone else's methodology. And so trying to be mindful of sharing your evaluation reports with partnering organizations, with your funders, with the community members you work with, and with other practitioners, or in settings like this at conferences, I think is a really important part of the process and building that community up. And it's also how we can get a better opportunity for that cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary benefit that we were talking about in terms of giving out to adjacent fields. And the last thing we'll mention for this is just please don't be afraid of recording mistakes. I think that that's something we've come against a lot during this project, is that it's intimidating and quite worrisome to share in a report that you have maybe done something that didn't result in the outcome you wanted, or maybe even caused harm. But if we aren't able to capture those processes, we actually can't prevent those mistakes in the future. So finding spaces to acknowledge those mistakes and to give recommendations for how others can do better in the future, I think is a really, really key part of the learning process. And so with that, that actually concludes our brief bit on monitoring and evaluation for learning. And I'd love to just open up the floor to any questions anyone has, whether about this presentation or any of the other modules we've touched on. We'd like to just be a really open space in the last next 10 or 15 minutes to touch on your thoughts and what you'd like to hear more about. And Alex, if you want to go ahead and stop screen sharing so we can all see each other's faces.
One question, just if people have, I'll open up for Eric, but one question that maybe for people after that, how do you capture failures? And I don't mean things could have been better, but where there really is a big problem. And there have been a few fail fests around. People often highlight them, but it's difficult, especially to get out of your institution. Within institutions you can kind of talk about it, but outside the institution it's very difficult. I'm wondering if anybody has any experience or advice on how to share failures. Not it could have been better, but where there's actually a failure. But maybe hold that thought. And Eric, you wanted to jump in on something.
Sure, that's actually a great question. Carl. So, you know, maybe the 2 or 3 things I would say now will give people a little bit of space to think about that, because I think that's just great. I wanted to highlight 2 things. One, yeah, first of all, thanks to everybody who was, you know, involved in putting this together and sharing so much rich insight. You know, I've seen the chat, people saying it was very useful, and for me too, very much so. One point that you made, Carl, right at the, I don't know, the last breakout group around, you know, the feasible sort of / necessary piece is something that I you know, I kind of think a lot about, and I like the way you put it. I think you know, I mean, we're, you know, monitoring kind of, you know, hectares being monitored is much easier than, you know, assessing like trust building between groups on, you know, forest management over time. And, you know, in a typical project cycle, it's much easier to monitor the former than kind of report on the latter. And, you know, it does require, I think, a commitment usually far beyond project cycles. It requires resources that don't always fit into, you know, what people are or organizations are willing to fund, because it's again beyond the project cycle, and it creates all kinds of challenges. And it's almost as though a completely separate body from you know, those attached to the specific projects need to be monitoring and evaluating the progress that's made about the groups of interventions, you know, that take place. I don't know what the answer is to that, and perhaps other people have been doing that in ways that where there is a good answer, but I think that's incredibly challenging. And I think it's the claim to peace is a very difficult one to make, and it's not something short term that we can easily handle. The other one is just, you know, there are the newer organizations in, you know, that are working with monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And this kind of touches on something that, you know, was brought up that Shehla was discussing, is that, you know, sometimes even for those who work in this field and who make a claim to having some kind of experience to share and provide expertise and support to an organization, you know, I think there's an accompaniment there that's really important. It's not a failure not to be good at it, you know, and working with organizations to tackle, you know, build, think through, develop these systems is something that takes time, and it requires commitment, and sometimes there is failure, and sometimes there are limitations, and it again, so you know, we don't all know the answers, and in a sense there's also a partnership between the practitioners, the organizations, the funders. And I think, you know, that's an important part of also thinking the way that we're doing this work. So anyway, to just to kind of give us a little space to think about those and other things. Thanks.
One
May
thing
I
that
please
makes me,
help?
oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura, please.
No, I was just going to make a brief observation that sometimes the specific project, the specific the task at hand can be successful, but the bigger overall picture cannot have achieved the result. You know, somebody needs a new valve in their heart. They get the successful operation. We put a new valve in, everything worked, but the rest of the plumbing in their system couldn't support it, and the patient died. Well, was the heart operation a failure? No, they successfully put in the new valve. I think about the operations in Afghanistan that I participated over and over again. There would be so many small things that we could go, there's a success. We're going to count that as success, you know, and how we define success, we can have a different conversation about. But if overall, did anything, you know, what was the result? And so I think sometimes just trying to figure out mentally, how do you reframe, Carl? How do you not go, well, that was a failure? And to go, what did we learn? how can we grow and how can we move forward? That particular instance didn't give the results that we were hoping for, and this is why. And just the, it's not mental gymnastics too much, but I do think that trying to call something and go, well, that really didn't go as we thought it should or would or could have. What do we do? How do we improve it? And to have an honest conversation, which, and at times that seems to be what we want to avoid, because everybody is so intent on making sure that they, stay in their lane and they don't step on toes, that we don't have those conversations.
I think both your comment, Laura, and also a lot of Eric's thoughts reminded me of just the importance of, you can be a practitioner who might be very interested in having a nuanced and serious conversation about what's gone wrong in your project. But I think you also have to have the support of your organization and of your funding organization to be able to put that information out there in a way that is helpful and useful to others. And I think that speaks to the really communal or systemic aspect of the monitoring and evaluation work we've been focusing on. Please, Erica, go ahead.
That is a very critical part of this, is setting the right tone at the beginning of the project. So when we were launching projects, when I was with Belmont Forum, we would have a kickoff, and there would be those two levels of like the inner project, evaluation design, and then the greater design of the forum itself, and understanding expectations behind that reporting. And, that challenges question was incredibly important. And we would actually synthesize that at a midpoint and an endpoint. We wanted them to come forward and say, I've been funded to do this participatory collaborative project with stakeholders. And because of COVID, I can't engage with them as I initially envisioned. And we would trade those stories in those events. This is the way we were able to engage with our group. You might try this, you might try that. So we had learning amongst the cohort. And, it was possible that some projects could turn it around midstream. But, there was a realization at the end of this is all an experiment. There are no certainties. We just wanted to see how it worked, because a lot of this is just, how does this dynamic play out? And there's incredible value in that.
What other thoughts do people have? We invite you to just bring them out. I see Ollie, you sent a chat message if you want to share out with the group.
I'm very aware I don't have anything particularly intelligent to say on this, so I'm just sort of in listening mode and taking it in, because it's interesting, and also trying to slightly multitask at the same time. So I may have missed a couple of things. No, just to say, again, just echoing what Erica was saying as well, is just finding ways of incentivizing the reporting of failures and challenges and so on is absolutely critical. And it's, in a way that also doesn't become a humble brag, because that's often the thing that comes out is, we had all of these challenges, but yay, we were successful. Look at how great we are. And that doesn't really, do anything else, but just, becomes a prop to burnish somebody's reputation. So, getting that right, I was just saying on a private message to Carl, I'm in the process of trying to think about, I've been asked by UNEP to help them think about some of their monitoring and reporting processes. And again, with a big organization like this, where you're trying to report on loads of different things at the same time, how do you get something that is feasible, deliverable, and how do you say this, institutionalizable across a big organization with people who may not be monitoring and reporting people? So that again is the key question I'm grappling with, is what is good enough for the purpose, and how do you sort of progressively make it easy for people to do the right thing in a sense of monitoring and reporting, and not to do it, as people have been saying, as a kind of, oh, well, we're at the end of the project and now we have to fill in this donor report let's make some stuff up, or let's construct, fill in the gaps wherever we can. So again, I'm really open to great ideas on other ways that that's worked, that aren't too sort of bureaucratically heavy, because I mean, Lord knows people in the UN are already drowning under enough red tape as it is. So, you know, how do you make something that is feasible, that will take up, that will deliver some of this thing, and then critically, I mean, this is another obvious point, actually affects project design and project management, you know, because otherwise these things are just done as boxes to tick at the end that don't necessarily, I mean, like you're saying, it's about learning and having a closed circle on this. So I mean, nothing particularly new on that, but these are just all questions I'm grappling with myself at the moment.
Thank you so much, Ali. Yeah, certainly. These are all questions that are, you know, don't have easy answers, I think, is one of the things that makes it difficult when you're trying to develop a toolkit, for example, and bringing these things together. Jill, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to everybody who is a part of designing this, this session. I think I've been thinking a lot about the question of failure lately and kind of how we better understand and learn from things. And two things that are rising to the surface in my considerations that I'll just share as something I'm still learning and thinking about. One is that one of the key things that, in addition to the challenges that has been raised in the chat, is like trying to understand, that's where we're recording where we've failed, is just the ongoing challenges that we're still trying to adjust and adapt to. But also thinking through what within those challenges are the trade-offs involved, and how can we make better trade-off decisions in the future based on what we've learned. Because it is always that, you know, we're trying to balance the resources and social capital, trust, et cetera, that we have, and make difficult choices based on that to get to the next step. So I think that that's where some of the lessons on failure can also come into play for next time. But then something else I've been considering is that talking about failure takes a tremendous amount of humility of all actors, but especially those of us that are in the seats that all of us are in, because I mean, we're not usually the ones paying the cost of failure. You know, most of us on this call are white people with internet access, you know, many of us in our comfortable homes. We're not the 5-year-old kid whose parents are now in jail because they were protesting an environmental hazard. We're not the ones paying the cost of the pursuit of peace most of the time. And so I think having real humility that, like, yes, we do need to learn from failure, but also we need to tread really lightly as we're going about that whole conversation.
I think that is an immensely important point, Jill, and thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a very strong point for us to close our conversation on, and gives all of us a lot of food for thought, particularly coming in from, you know, oftentimes development agencies and things of the like, and the positionality that affords practitioners in these cases. And so with that, we have just a few minutes left. And first, I want to say thank you all so much for sticking out with us for 3 hours this afternoon, all on camera for a lot of the time, actively engaging for a lot of the time. I know that that's incredibly hard to do in this day and age when everything is virtual. And so we really appreciate you bringing the energy to us today. And with that, we'd like to just close out by doing a bit of monitoring and evaluation of our own. We've put together a feedback form for you. We will actually keep the call on, and you can turn your cameras off and just work on that so that you don't have to remember to find the link later or do anything like that. So we'll keep the room open for another 5 to 7 minutes to let you do that. And once again, thank you so much. If you're interested in being further involved in the work with the M&E project and the toolkit, please feel free to reach out to Carl, Amanda, or myself. We're always happy to have you more involved in this work, and of course, to share a draft of the toolkit when it comes out.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Oh, and of course, a big thank you to Alex and Anna for their incredible tech support during this incredibly long breakout room laden session.
To Erica and Eric for facilitating.
Great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for attending.
Shehla, do you see Jean's comment? She wants to provide input, but she needs to take a break. People can provide input tomorrow if they need to, right? We don't.
Of course. We'll keep the forum open for you, and we can try to send it out in an email as well. Things are a little hectic, but we will do our best to get that out to you in the morning, perhaps. Of course. Thank you for your great input today, Laura. We appreciated it. Great conversing with you in the breakout rooms. Also, fantastic job again, Alex and Anna. Really appreciate it. For a session this long, especially, I think being able to keep everything on the ball is tough. So great work, and I hope you take a nice rest tonight. I know it's getting late over there for you all.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great.
Of course. All right. And with that, I think we can close out. Thank you all so much.